Really excited to have everybody here today. We're going to be talking about chapters 3 and 4. As we get started, we'd love to have you help us spread the word, share what you're hearing, and use our hashtag Startup Growth Club that we've got in the lower left corner. Not only are we going to read those, but Sean and Morgan are going to read those, and this will be something that we can use to, not only help ask them questions as we do a show with Sean in the end. But Morgan has also said that he's going to take questions. He can't join us for that show, but he's going to be able to record some answers. So whatever you're hearing that you find interesting or questions, please go ahead and share those on the hashtag. Also, today, it's not really about what I have to say. I'm much more interested in what all of you found interesting about this book. So if you can and you have something to share, go ahead and click that right lower corner button there that's got the raise your hand, and we'll bring you up into the discussion and would love to hear what you have to say. I'll share some prompts, and it'll be great to have a nice discussion with all of you. Also, if you want to join us on Goodreads, we are discussing these books in between the shows. This is also just book one of several that we're going to read together with other fellow startup founders and team members. So we just posted the link in the chat. Join us there, and we'll continue to be able to build up that community of other startup folks that want to learn together. Finally, if you are wanting to join us for the next couple of Fridays and for the final show that we have with Sean, we've got a handy add to calendar link that we'll put in the chat, and then you can use that to be able to remind yourself, and it'll have the show link in there each week. We're also going to be simulcasting this to YouTube. So if you want to watch the recording later or share it with somebody or go back and see yourself on screen, then we'll put our YouTube channel link in the group there and chat. And so then you can check it out there. All right. Well, thanks everybody for letting me know about the audio issue. And now we're on our way. I'm really excited that today we're going to be joined by Ethan Garr. Let me go ahead and bring him up on stage. Ethan.
Hey, how's it going?
Good. Welcome to the show.
Oh, thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here and talk about hacking growth.
Yeah, I'm excited to have you here too. And I wanted to just give you a moment to introduce yourself and share a little bit about your background. And before you do that, I'll just say the reason that I was really excited to have you is that last week I talked with several of the people who joined us for the show. And one thing they said pretty consistently was, hey, Justin, it'd be great if we had somebody who could join us in this discussion who's actually done some of this stuff before, because we'll have questions about, how was it like when you tried that? So really excited to have you here.
Yeah, super excited to be here. So I will tell you a little bit about me, but I think, one thing about hacking growth is, I do think it's a great, really a textbook for driving growth in your business and accelerating, creating a predictable route for accelerating growth. But it is really hard, regardless of how well you study the book, to put those things together and get all the wheels turning at once. I mean, ultimately, growth is this product of flywheels. So it can be challenging to get a flywheel going. So I've made lots of mistakes along the way. I've been fortunate. So I started my career a long time ago in public relations and ended up getting poached by one of our clients, which was a company called Uproar.com. And that's where I ended up meeting and working with Sean. And right away, he really introduced me to this idea of this test learn approach to growth. And it was a very different time, but a lot of the principles that he was really developing, we were applying early on. And again, making lots of mistakes, but learning a lot along the way. And that was sort of during the early .com boom. So we went in different directions, but always stayed close. And then eventually, after some time away from tech, running a offline startup, I ended up taking the growth reins on at a company called Teltech in New Jersey, which made telecommunications apps. And eventually, we co-invented RoboKiller, which is a mobile app that stops telemarketing calls on your mobile phone. And that was really a breakout growth success. That process was accelerated by the fact that I had read Hacking Growth. I was constantly talking with Sean. Eventually had him come in and teach a workshop with my team. And we were able to apply a lot of these principles and really, adopt them to our own needs. And I think that's what, I think the conversation around today will be about. It's yes, this gives you a great guideline for getting started. It gives you some guardrails, but ultimately every team and every product and service is different, and you have to apply growth in different ways. So today I train and coach teams who are looking to grow faster, and I co-host the podcast, the Breakout Growth podcast with Sean as well.
Yeah, that's a great background, and one of the reasons that we're really excited to have you here today. I'm actually looking forward to a future time where you and I get to discuss more about how you applied a lot of these practices to RoboKiller, because I know that's a pretty awesome story.
Yeah, it was fantastic.
So let's dive in. Hacking Growth, as Ethan was saying, it's a practical guide on how to crank up growth and drive success. The author's Sean Ellis. He helped turn multiple startups into billion-dollar companies, including Dropbox, LogMeIn, Eventbrite, and more. In fact, Sean is the one who's credited with coining the term growth hacking. And his co-author, Morgan Brown, has been a part of multiple growth teams as well for billion-dollar companies like Facebook and now Shopify, where he's currently the VP of growth. So in other words, these guys really know what they're doing when it comes to growth. If you weren't with us last week, I'll just give you a couple of key takeaways that we learned. One, a growth team is a cross-functional team where engineering and data analysts are cornerstones of that team. It's not just a marketing thing. And so no matter if the team is permanent or temporary, it also requires that you have top-down support to be successful. That's really key because it is cross-functional, and otherwise you'll get people saying, this is not my job. And another really important thing we learned is that before you can grow, you need to actually know that your product is a must-have. And that's where that must-have test or the product market fit survey really comes into play. And if it's not a must-have, then you need to use that product market fit survey method to get you to a point where you can actually dial in the product. And then if it is a must-have, you have to understand what's that aha moment for customers, and how do you get your new customers to that moment as quickly as possible. So if you haven't read, you're caught up on pretty much the big points. Now let's dive into the really awesome parts that we learn here in 3 and 4. And the first one that I want to start with is the tragic story of Everpix. This is a really interesting one. And a thing that stuck out to me in that story was the way that some of the founders were afraid of trying certain techniques because of a fear of annoying users. And in the end, Everpix didn't make it as a company. And so I'm really curious about the way, when you're reading this, all of you watching, that balance of achieving growth and not annoying users, it's an important one. And I'd love to hear what you have to say. Please go ahead and raise your hand. That's in the lower right corner. And while you do that, Ethan, I'd love to hear, have you heard this kind of pushback before?
Definitely. I mean, what I experienced is, you always have people in the room who have their own concerns based on their view of where they sit in the organization and their view of the growth engine. Engineers want to make sure that things don't break. Marketing people want to make sure that the message gets across properly. All of those things are really important. And I think when it comes to growth, it's very important to always, the answer to everything is make it an experiment. That when you create an experiment, one of the key things, and I think, I don't know if it was really surfaced in chapter 4 as much, but one of the things when I run experiments is I list out risks. And risks can be very small or they can be very big. I'm not a fan of betting the entire organization on a test, but at the same time, I think you do need to take some risk when you run experiments. Otherwise, you won't get the learnings. But it's also important to manage risk. So if you're running an experiment and you have some concerns that it might annoy people, look for ways where you might be able to run it on either for a shorter time or to a smaller group for that you can kind of understand their reaction to it, and measure. If one of the concerns is that we're going to annoy customers, in the process, figure out as one of your metrics for the test how you're going to know whether that's actually a problem or not. But the danger is in assumptions. If you have to turn guesses into facts. That's the whole purpose of experimentation. Sean beats that into me every time we chat, we talk. Everybody has their guesses. Everybody has their thoughts on what will work, what won't work, what matters, what's going to affect users. You have to use experimentation to answer those questions and not let your own assumptions overwhelm you in that process.
That's really interesting. I don't recall that risks was part of chapter 4. Maybe it was, and it's just not sticking out in my head at the moment, but that's a really good insight. And it seems to me that there's like 2 types of risks. The risk if we try this experiment, which to your point can always be rolled back if it fails and annoys users. But then there's also the risk of what happens if we don't do it. What happens if we just, keep the status quo? Are we hitting our goals?
And that's the Everpick story, right? They let the risk and the fear paralyze them, and it prevented them from getting the learnings that maybe could have driven that breakout growth success. So, it's I think you have to be aggressive in your testing and experimentation, and also, perfection is the enemy of done. So, get experiments out there that are reasonable and good, but get them out there. Otherwise, you won't get that knowledge that you need to drive that flywheel.
Yep. That's a great point. All right. The next piece that I thought was interesting, and by the way, some great comments coming in on the chat. If you want to be able to join us up here, go ahead and hit the raise your hand button. Would love to hear what you all have to say. After all, that's the whole reason we're doing this show. But while we wait for that, there's another part where we talk about the table of experiments. From Andy Johns, he illustrates that, a long test, how long a test must run in order to reach statistical significance. And I thought this was a really important reminder, because oftentimes when you hear tests, I don't know why, but it's always this example of like the color of a button. That's sort of this thing that, let's run a test and see if we changed it from red to blue, what's going to happen. And a key point that he makes is, if it doesn't make a big jump in performance, something on the magnitude of like a 30% increase, it's going to take a very long time for that test to reach statistical significance, which is important because that's the only way reliably that the improvement you're making is an actual improvement. But if you have something where it makes just a small bump, it can take an extremely long time. And I thought this was a really eye-opening, crystallizing way, to make a point of the types of bets that you need to be making in your experiments. I'm sure that this is something you're well familiar with, but just would love to hear what you think.
Yeah, I think, we had a really interesting conversation with Morgan Brown on our podcast, talking about big risks versus incremental growth. And I think I've always looked at it this way. The small experiments give you the muscle. They teach you the muscles that you need to get the big wins. I'm a little conflicted here because I agree, like changing button colors is not probably a way to break out growth, right? You need to pick bigger things that matter. At the same time, when you're just getting started, you may not have all the tools in place to run the big experiments that you want to run the way you want to run them. So sometimes, to me, running the smaller tests that give you the learnings is super important. Now, the caveat to that, of course, is if you're never going to get a learning from it because of the statistical significance issue you just described, that's not good either. So I think there's balance in finding the right experiments to run that are going to make an impact. And I think, one of the kind of the key things, it's in chapter 4, I think, but one of the key things is to realize that when you choose your experiments, when you ideate on experiments, ideating on everything you could do is probably not as a great idea. Ideating on a focused objective that you think can actually move the needle, that's how you get, you come up with a set of ideas to experiment, and you surface the ones that are the most important, the ones that are going to matter the most. And then I think that helps you find the balance.
Yeah, that's a great point. And Vince, thank you for raising your hand. Let me bring you up here. Hey, Vince.
Hey,
Vince.
Can you hear me?
Yep, you're just fine.
Yeah, I have as I was thinking about this, my head was swimming with chapter 3, just on applying it to my current reality and thinking all the different ways. First, change management of getting people to possibly embrace this approach, etc. But on this topic of sample size and, I guess the duration to get to attribution, so to speak, with confidence, it got me thinking about our situation. And if for example, our North Star were in real estate, were transactions, number of transactions, that was our North Star. Let's just say that's the case. The time it takes changes to manifest into more deals being closed seems like it might be prohibitive to the pace of testing.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I'd love to hear just a little more about where you're at and how your company works, because I think there's an interesting point to that that's unique to not just your business, but maybe others that kind of in your similar space.
Yeah, one of the things that, as I was reading this, we're very focused on growth.
And remind me
EXP
your company
Realty.
Name? Yeah, thank you.
And doing quite well. And one of those factors that we look at is growth in agent count. And that has been growing very well, 100% year over year for a few years. And I find myself wanting to also broaden that view, or maybe look at it from a different perspective as I was reading chapter 3. And one of those was, the number of transactions, that productivity, if you will, of our collective agents. And as I think about that in relation to the testing, it got me wondering about the latency that it would take to realize the benefits of some of what you do in making agents more productive, and then actually seeing it in end results. And are you talking about months there where you're trying to confirm one change and not muddy the waters with multiple tests, and not being able to attribute the delta to any one of them?
Yeah. Ethan.
So yeah, I think this is a classic. It's a classic problem B2B companies face, is that they often don't have the kind of volume where you can get to statistical significance quickly to get those learnings. And I think there's a couple of things. One is, my first recommendation is, I read a book years ago by Guy Kawasaki called Rules for Revolutionaries. And he had this chapter called Don't Worry, Be Crappy, which probably goes against a lot of what people say, but I think it is better to, of course, aim for getting it right. But also aim for figuring out different ways to get the learnings. In some cases, you may not be able to get to that statistical significance, but you may still be able to get learnings, but there may be different ways to do it. Another thing you might be able to do is that final transaction, which may be very few. There may be very few of those final transactions, and that, and it may take a long time to get to them, but you may be able to find things that are up funnel that are indicators that you will get to the final transaction. So in other words, if you look at the final transaction, you say, what happens a month earlier, 3 months earlier, 95% of the time that will lead to that transaction, then you may be able to use that as sort of a proxy for the, and then you may be able to experiment against that that metric instead. So it's imperfect, but perfection's the enemy of done.
Right.
It's good insight. Thanks for joining us, Vince.
Sure.
Okay. That's actually a great segue, I think, into another piece that I found really interesting, which is the fundamental growth equation. This really handy equation for being able to say, here's all the different things that are the metrics that add up to what drives our growth. So in some ways, it sounds like you're saying maybe one of those metrics could end up being what you could potentially test for if getting to that sort of final transaction isn't possible. I don't know if that's true. What are your thoughts on that?
It's funny, I'm really glad, that you're hosting this, because honestly, I hadn't read the book in a while, and rereading that chapter, I was like, why is the fundamental growth equation not more of like fundamental to my conversation that I'm having? It's like, I talk about North Star metrics all the time, but that one, it was a good reminder that can be valuable. And look, in every case is going to be different. I don't know if that works in Vince's case, and I think, when I think about that fundamental growth equation, what I think it for me, what it speaks to is taking a step back and looking at your entire growth engine and trying to understand how all the pieces work together to impact outcomes. And that's really hard to do if you are focused on one silo. If you're focused solely on acquisition, or if you're too far over-indexing on retention, it's very hard to see the whole growth picture in focus. So I think the fundamental growth equation, it is a really good way to try to understand how, it's yet another way to look at how the growth levers work together. Sean and I model, if you look at some of the growth studies that we've published, we have a little diagram of the growth engine for the companies that we dove into, and you get to see all those pieces together. And then you're asking yourself the question, where can we have the impact? I think if you can back into an equation, that's one more tool to help you really figure out where that impact is going to be.
Yeah, I thought it was also super helpful that they had a couple of examples, for eBay and for Amazon, where they broke down, here's the things that go into the growth. And I mean, I immediately wanted Andy to come and do that for my company, because there's sort of basics that, as the book says, that are similar to us all, but then there's, the nuance that's unique to our business that is really quite powerful. But yeah, I'm with you. I felt like that was a part of the book that, why am I not hearing more about that as an important part of the toolkit that every company who's either making their way to growth or in growth has clearly,
Yeah, it like I said, it got me thinking. It made me think, wow, I gotta start sort of looking at different businesses and thinking about what that equation might look like, and then try to better understand how to put that together.
Yeah.
And I see Vince is asking questions about when do you know when to multiply versus add. I don't know that I have a great answer for that. I think probably what you need to do is you need to model it out and then sort of run simulations through it to see if it's making sense.
Yeah. In some ways, once you're an established company, reflecting on how eBay or Amazon or a company like that is growing is maybe obvious because it's evident in the way that they function as a company. But before you get there, it's another test and learn.
For sure.
That's great. Another metric that I know you talk about a lot, and many growth marketers do, is the North Star metric, and what a potent way that is to focus the team on the outcomes that matter. And I thought one thing that was interesting is in the book, it gives the example of Facebook, which
Mhm.
one of their early ones was to get new users to friend 7 people in 10 days. And in some ways, that kind of felt like a mini version of a fundamental growth equation. And it started getting me thinking: is the fundamental growth equation and North Star the same thing? How do these two things coexist? I don't know if you have thoughts on that. And by the way, if anyone else has questions about that or wants to weigh in, please remember, go ahead and you can hit that raise your hand button in the lower right corner, that red one.
My initial response is be careful conflating the two. And
Okay.
the reason I say that is that what I think makes a effective and powerful North Star metric is its simplicity. I mean, look at Uber, monthly, weekly rides. I think it is Airbnb, nights booked. Right. The second that your North Star metric, I always say, like, if your North Star metric is some weird decimal point, based on some equation that no one really understands, like, just start over, because the simplicity of it. I mean, essentially, what is your North Star metric? It's a quantification of the value you create for end users.
Mm,
And I think that's super important. Now, the growth equation, I think, does that too, but I think it looks at a much bigger, a much more detailed kind of view of that. North Star metric says, fundamentally, how do customers get value from our product, and how can we put that into it? How can we view that? How can we see a number that we can affect change on? So, I think as people think about finding the North Star metric for their business, like, just don't overthink it. Start with what is the must-have experience? What is value being created? And what's the articulation of that as a metric? And just keep, as my friend Nate says, keep hitting it with the simple stick.
Yeah, I think you've really made a good distinction there on, North Star metric being essentially you're being customer focused at that point. How do we know that we are unlocking value for the customer? With the idea that has a direct or indirect impact on the growth equation,
Mhm.
which is sort of how you calculate the dollars that you should be stacking, right? And so they kind of have some connectivity, but yeah, I can see how they're sort of a different focus.
Yeah, I mean, they're absolutely connected. But to me, one of the great powers of a North Star metric, well articulated, well used, well conceived and well articulated through a business, is it breaks down silos and gets everyone pointed towards the same place,
Yeah.
towards the North Star. I think the way for that to take hold and for it to take shape in a business or in an organization is for everybody to fundamentally see it as that articulation of customer value.
Yeah.
And then, it's really interesting. When I started at Teltech, like I said, I'd been out of technology for a while, and I was out in California just before I was about to start. And I asked Sean one day, I said, what's the thing you think what's the most important thing I can do in this new role? And he said, help everyone find their role in growth in the North Star metric. And at the time, I don't think I truly understood what that meant. I think it took me some time to figure it out. But if individuals and teams understand how they impact that metric, they can do great things. And moreover, they can communicate with each other in a way that together they can do great things. Small organization, five men and women sitting around the table. Very easy for everyone to get on the same page. You say, we're going to work on this. There's only so many resources. Everybody knows where to go, right or wrong. 50-person organization, harder. 5,000-person organization, probably really hard. So the North Star is a really great way to ground everyone, from just at that same starting point.
Yeah, important insight. I like that. All right, Vince, thank you for raising your hand, and welcome back to the show.
Sure. Long time listener, first time caller. That's not true. One of the things that as I was going through this, I am in one of those larger organizations. We're probably 2,000 plus staff members anyway. And one of the things that as I was going through North Star exercise and making my own theories about what that North Star could or should be, one of the things I quickly found myself thinking about is the power of, or the value that it could provide to help prioritize and just narrow down some of the even the proposals that come through of things we could be doing, ways we could be spending our money, and as a centralizing question to say, okay, but how does that move the needle X? How does that move this needle? Can we, can we get a sense for how it does, and therefore provide a more meaningful mechanism to understand where you apply your finite resources?
Yeah, that sounds a lot like what's coming up here in chapter 4 on having that template for the ideas. And I think you're spot on in terms of when you have a lot of ideas, how can you have a criteria?
Yeah. If you didn't have constraints, you wouldn't need strategy.
Any thoughts on
I would
that?
I would just say what's one of the things that's just been super valuable for me in taking Hacking Growth and then building the principles from it and the processes out in the real world is to continuously adapt and look at like, okay, what's working, what's not working. And one of the things for me that I learned kind of early was if I didn't really have good documentation around how we were going to run experiments, we got ourselves into trouble. And a lot of things that the book talks about in terms of writing out good hypotheses, having a good sort of executive summary as a descriptor, you start to internalize and figure out what's the right way for you to do it. And, there's little things like, I learned that like if I can making good titles for our names for our experiments actually had an impact. So I think when you look at the North Star metric, when you look at the North Star metric as part of your business, what I don't think it should be is something that sits somewhere in your business and isn't articulated. I think to Vince's point, it should be part of the prioritization process. It should be part of the thinking process. I actually, again, the vision documents that I advocate for each experiment, I have a section called where I ask the question, how does this impact the North Star metric? Now, again, like the danger is in thinking that the North Star metric, I don't love that idea of the one metric that matters. I think that's a different thing. And it's not good or bad. I just think like thinking of the North Star metric as the only metric that matters is a terrible mistake. The North Star metric, because not everything you do, you may be able to see the impact, here's our North Star metric, and it drives this directly. A lot of times there's a sub-metric or sub-metrics that impact the North Star metric, and you're trying to impact those. But if you can't see from point A, where the experiment, to some impact on the North Star metric, you should really ask yourself the question, why are we running this experiment? It probably is not it's probably not really valuable to our end users, and therefore not valuable to the business.
Yeah, that's excellent point. And I wanted to open up a little more broadly. These were some of the things that I found interesting. And for those of you who are watching and reading along, I'd love to hear what you highlighted in chapter 3 that we haven't talked about. And maybe while you go through your book or Kindle or whatever you're reading on, I'll just start us off with one. And at any point, if you want to weigh in, just go ahead and click that raise your hand button in the lower right corner. The one that I have highlighted here is, while the practice of talking to users in the early development stage of testing a prototype has become widespread, at far too many startups and established companies, it falls by the wayside once the product has been launched. This idea of how important it is to regularly talk to your customers. We know that's important in the very beginning because we sort of have a dearth of ideas. But then over time, you know, we we lose that practice. And it looks like we've got Luciano to join us here. One moment. Hey, Luciano.
Hey,
Love
can
to
you hear me?
hear. Yeah, thank you. We have to all ask that today because I started off
Yeah.
with such a great technical mishap. Introduce yourself. Welcome to the show.
Yeah, thanks for putting this on, man. It's super useful. I stopped paying for all these startup clubs so I could just come to your podcast. So my name is Luciano. I have a startup called Energy. We are a hydration science company. We do packaged powdered supplements, and then we're working on a healthcare app. Well, a wellness app. I don't want to say healthcare, but
Prevented.
perfect. There you go. So it's funny because this where we are with this started from, we were actually building software for gyms to increase their revenue. And I went through Founders Institute, and everything about it was talk to customers, talk to this. Like the sprints were like, one of my sprints was like, you have to talk to 100 people and get at least 5 recorded 30-minute interviews in the next 2 weeks. It was like ridiculous.
Wow.
But we just kept like getting to this point and finding like a product that works. We did all of that. And now we're doing like, all the photos and the NFL camps and all of that. And we're just pushing and pushing and pushing. And I saw that and I was like, man, I haven't talked to anybody in a long time. And this is not my first time doing a startup. This is not my first time working for a big company or a high growth startup. And I've never seen that like being put at the forefront of what you're doing before this. I've never done it. I've done sales, and it just made me think like, how many times have I made a decision that I wasn't even paying attention to that caused a result that was adverse? Because, simple as with supplement powders, right? Like we do a lot of research at the cellular level on what makes hydration effective, which is cool. Like until people start taking it and, this person is running a marathon or this person is doing CrossFit. So after that, man, I just went back and I told everybody like, hey, let's take a step back. For example, our night formula, we realized that, you need probably more vitamin D at night if you're doing certain things. And we went and we changed all this formulas, we changed all the bags, and we changed everything. And then as people started using it, they were like, actually, the other formula worked better. That was like a $6,000 mistake in just bag cost. So yeah, I will now make sure before we make, and I fund my startup myself. I haven't raised any capital. So a $6,000 mistake for me is like, a lot of wasted bags and boxes and tissue paper. So man, I think it's probably one of the most critical things that we overlook, especially when it comes to financial decisions, when you're like, trying to keep your burn rate super low. So good stuff for that.
Yeah. I love all those great examples. And Ethan, I'm sure you've probably seen this many times.
Yeah, and honestly, I am as guilty as everyone else on it too. And I, first of all, like congratulations on what sounds like pretty awesome stuff that you're doing. And making $6,000 mistakes sometimes is an indication that you're doing a lot of things right too. I'm sure you don't want to repeat it. And I think the biggest thing is make lots of mistakes, just make them once.
Right.
Learn from it.
Yeah.
But I think in general, talking to customers is the thing that we talk about the most and do the least of. And the mistake I used to make is, I walked into my growth meeting and I would say, team, we need to be talking to our customers. Your job is to get out there and talk to customers, figure it out. And if they could have figured it out, they would have. But we're all busy. We're all trying, and it's just very time consuming. But I think the mistake that we make is that we think that speaking to customers means we have to speak to hundreds of customers. You're trying to get the pulse, and often you start, in 10, 15 calls max, right? You start to hear the same thing over and over again, right? I mean, you probably didn't need 100 calls to find out that people like the old powder better. You probably started to realize that pretty quick. Talking to customers one-to-one is probably never going to be a statistically significant exercise. That's not the goal. The goal is it's qualitative analysis that you use in conjunction with your quantitative analysis. So I think I think the danger is fits and spurts, right? You just said, I haven't talked to anybody. So now you're like focused on it. And the question is, are you going to operationalize that now? Or are you going to do it right now because you're nervous that you haven't been doing it? And then after you do it for a spurt, you talk to 100 customers, you feel good about yourself. And then 4 months later, you're like, oh man, I haven't talked to any customers since then, right? Much, much better if you can find that cadence where you're talking to customers regularly. I'm working with a company now that's creating a advisory board with customers. I think that's a good tactic. A team I worked with several months ago, we had every Friday voice of the customer meeting. And what we tried to do is just make it really fun and entertaining. And we would either bring customers in and chat with them, or we would sometimes we would have our customer service team articulate some of the concerns that they had heard directly from customers. But every week, 1 week we brought in a usability expert who taught us about how usability in your app or services can help you better connect with your customers. So it wasn't every week we were actually talking to customers, but every week we were putting an hour of focus on how are we going to talk, how do we think about the voice of the customer and actually realize that. So I think it's important for teams to operationalize talking to customers and not do it as a short-term project. That's the danger of it. But look, you have talked to customers. You just have to figure out the process for doing it on a regular basis. And I think if you read the Startup Founders Guide by Steve Blank, I believe that's the one. He really talks about the importance of it and the importance that the founder does it. That founders do it, and like the people, they actually talk to customers because you can't, to some degree, you can't farm it out.
Right. And I think for me in particular, it was part of when you're building formulas that eventually will customize to the user experience. I think we lumped or to the use case, right? So, if somebody's doing something, then as we get bigger machines, better technology, we'll be able to customize those. So we just lumped all of that in one box and put it down the road. Like right now we need commercials and sponsors and we got to be at this event and all that. And it was like, dude, we missed quite a bit of, okay, what do you use it for? And how do you use it? And in the early stages, I think it's important because it gives you, well, I don't want to say in the early stages. I mean, it's important. There it is again, right? In the early stages, it's important. As you go along, it is important, not just in what I do, but in anything, because people's use case will change as they grow and evolve. And when you're dealing with athletic performance or, even something as simple as QuickBooks, when I was doing this, if I was first trying to bulk, what my use case is going to be different. So we now have that as a core strategy to say, hey, if we want to keep people buying from us and not GNC, then we need to be able to evolve as they grow. So it's as simple as when we redid those bags, well, let's put a QR code on it so we can collect feedback right from the bag. So yeah, we definitely have made the decision like, okay, whatever we do, that has to be our core focus. We can't put it down the road because it's a consumable.
Yeah.
Right.
Yep. Awesome. Hey, thank you, Luciano. Appreciate you raising your hand.
I feel like there's 1,000 things we could talk about just on that topic, but
yeah,
I don't want to go too far down that rabbit hole.
No, it's good. And I think, just because of chapter 4 here, I want to make sure we get to touch a little bit on the key things that come out of that. And one of the first things that struck me when reading chapter 4 and you're getting into the high tempo of testing was that if you're, some of the leading growth teams, they're running 20 to 30 experiments per week. And as, a company that's not well resourced to be able to do something like that yet, that was like, oh my goodness. Which of course, it says if you're, more of an early stage startup, 1 to 2 experiments per week is a great way to get started. But just interesting to see, where does it go from the 1 to 2 per week, man, all the way up to that. That seems like those must be big teams, or they're just well oiled at that point. I'm sure you've seen it at both stages.
Yeah, I think when Sean, I can't speak for Sean or Morgan, but I think when they wrote this, they really focused on high tempo testing and they make a good point as to why high tempo testing is super important. I think over time, they've also balanced that with high impact testing. And really, not to say that the book doesn't say that you should be, that you should run lousy tests, a million lousy tests. It actually is very clear about that. But I think it's sort of some hybrid of, it's like high tempo valuable testing or something. Yeah, like meaningful testing that we should be striving for. When I got excited about bringing this growth process into my team at Teltech, and this is before RoboKiller, I was out in California. I was visiting with Sean. We were chatting. He got me so excited about this. I left his office. I get on the phone right away with our CFO because I couldn't get in touch with our CEO. And I'm like, I know how we're going to grow with this. I was just so, wrapped up with, we're going to do high tempo testing and we're going to win. And we got it going and started to really push for more and more tests. And very quickly, I realized that what we were calling tests were not great tests at best. Mm-hmm. We hadn't really put the pieces together to run valuable experiments. And instead of having this nice, trajectory of test improvement that you're looking for, what we really had was fits and starts. And, we ran a bunch of tests. A bunch of them didn't, you're not doing it right if your test failed to yield a result. A test, by definition, a hypothesis is not right or wrong. It's proven or disproven. And the learning is what's valuable. Of course, you want that to be proven and you want to be able to amplify it. But lots of tests are going to fail. But if you run a test and you don't get a result, that's what kills teams. That's what kills the momentum. It kills enthusiasm for this process. So it's important to build up to this in a way that's meaningful. So while I do think, you're, long term, if you can get to the point where you're running 20, 30 tests a week, that's awesome. But I would focus first on how do we run 1 or 2 really high quality tests and yield a result, use that in this process and get the learning. And that's what makes chapter 4 challenging, right? On paper, it all makes sense. But in the real world, that first growth meeting, right, where you're supposed, they Morgan and Sean lay out like what the first second 15 minutes, I think, you review the tests from last week. What if you don't have tests from last week? What do you do at that time, right? It's a flywheel. And the hardest part of getting a flywheel started is that first turn. And you can't sort of do this just a little bit. You have to do all of it all at once, right? You have to run. You can't say, well, I'm kind of going to run an experiment this week. You have to run the experiment. So a lot of times, as you're starting, you can look at what you're doing and see if you can refine what you're already doing as projects into actually good experiments and get that part into the process. But I wouldn't focus. I would say, if you're just running 1 test at a time, your goal should be to speed that up. If you're running 2 or 3, keep working to speed that up, but speed it up based on your success with your experiments. And again, success being measured as, did we get a result and can we learn from it?
Yeah, those are really good insights. Particularly about the difference between maybe how the structure of the meeting will be once you've built the muscle and you have momentum and you have an idea pipeline as compared to maybe how it will start in the way that, if you're not cognizant of that and you're not adjusting to how it's like when you start, it can be demoralizing for a team. And I like this idea of measuring success as about, did we get to proven or disproven, not necessarily, was this something that we're going to implement?
Yeah. Because especially because if you do that, like if success demands that that every test is a win, it will be demoralizing because most tests won't be a win.
Right.
And it was kind of I'm glad I went through the hard parts of this and made lots of mistakes early on. I wrote this article. It's still out there somewhere. It's called. It's like I think if you just Google like how to ruin an experiment, and I talked about like multiple ways that we failed to our experiments failed where and there's lots of reasons why experiments fail. A good one that causes a lot of failure is you didn't have a good hypothesis, and Morgan talks about this. But I was at a conference and years ago, and I'm forgetting the gentleman's name. His last name's Algard. I always try to give him credit for it because it's not mine. But he explained that a bad hypothesis says if we change A into B, something will happen. A good hypothesis says by changing A into B, we expect to see C. And I like the idea. Morgan leaves it up to the reader. I'm saying Morgan because I was listening to the audiobook where he's reading that chapter. But Sean and Morgan say whether your hypothesis is tied to a specific number or not, he kind of leaves it to you. I like tying your hypothesis to a specific number. We expect to see this improve 10%. Now, of course, it often you want to make that guess as good as possible, but a lot of times you have no idea. But my thinking is if you pick a number that would be meaningful for you, like a 10% improvement on this would be meaningful for the business, then what happens is it gives you a starting point in the analysis. If you were expecting 10% and you got 8%, is it a win or a loss? I don't know, but at least you have a starting point. Well, we thought 10% was a win, so is 8% a win? Maybe not. But certainly 20% would feel like a big win. So, But again, I think all of this it takes time, and probably the one caution I would give to anybody who's reading the book and about to implement this into their business is to stick with it and understand that it's often challenging, especially in the beginning, to get the wheels rolling, the wheels turning. But when you do, the rewards can be amazing. But it really does depend on everybody, getting buy-in and giving people the space to get things wrong, but also really participate. And I think what I really like about Chapter 4 is talking about getting people involved in the ideation process across the organization, even external to the organization. I think that's a really good point. Ideas are great. If you can, I can come up with them faster than you can test them. That's the problem.
I love that. One thing I'll just say for those of you who are watching, if you want to weigh in, I'd love to hear things that you highlighted in Chapter 4. And, while you're maybe looking through to find something that you highlighted or found very interesting, I'll just share one that's a riff off of what you were just saying, which is the idea submission process. And one thing that struck me is I thought that the template that was provided for an idea was a good template, and to some degree, the ICE prioritization works a bit like putting a number on the project and a hypothesis. It's not maybe exactly what you were saying, but then it also, obviously at UpFocus we have a very similar concept, which we call proposals, to have this sort of structured what we might work on. And I think one thing that we found is it's really hard to ask everybody to fill one of those out, right? The structure that is provided, takes a skill and and some time, and might limit the amount of ideas that you get if you ask people, hey, you have to fill this out to this level of completeness. So I know one thing that we do is we make it possible to just gather feedback in whatever form that people have it. And that becomes fodder for those who are good at translating these into a hypothesis and idea. So it still allows you to get that contribution from everyone, while sort of divvying up the work to people. I'm curious, how have you seen that sort of idea creation and contribution process play out?
Yeah, I have made the mistake of saying, come up with a bunch of ideas and not putting a template for what ideas should look like into play. I do agree. I think the idea, like, you need the proposal, which I think for what you're describing, I think is more what I have described personally as our vision documents for experiments, that you call it whatever works for your business. Which, has, that's where I'm outlining the risks. That's where I'm outlining what data we'll need to collect. But I try to keep those short, because I think 10-page documents. I always say it should take you less than half an hour to write, and it should be a page and a half max.
Right.
But when in the ideation stage, right? I don't think you have to go that detailed in the ideation stage, right? Like listing out the risks at that point. Like let's get the idea and say, this is going to be impactful and valuable, and we can do it. Figure that out before you say, maybe we shouldn't because it's too risky. That just seems like that's a stage 2 problem, and probably not a real problem in most cases. So I think when I've created sort of idea submission templates, what I've focused on is, I mentioned before, short title that tells the story. Like, to me, I've seen so many ideas that are like homepage, right? Like, the problem is, at some point you're trying to get a team to vote on the best ideas, right?
Have you ever tried to create a Mad Lib style build your sentence for the title type template? I'm curious.
No, but I have done that more for the hypothesis, right? By changing X into Y, we expect to see a Z. I will essentially do exactly that, because I do think, I think if we can get teams speaking in hypotheses, it's a great language to, because the hypothesis tells you the who, what, why, and what we expect, or the why is what we expect, why we're doing this. And I think a really well-written hypothesis can get everybody really galvanized around an idea. But to me, to submit an idea, you need a good title and a description that gives the basics of what we're testing, where, what, and why. And ideally, if your team is mature enough to express it in hypotheses, I think that's a great way to do it. But it's all got to be really short, because one of the things that, and again, this is like a mistake I made right out of the book, it's gather all these ideas and then, nominate the best ideas. Well, like I said, my team was great at coming up with ideas. It was like, we were trying to, show each other up with how many ideas we could have. 100 ideas, trying to prioritize 100 ideas is impossible. If you're asking the team, hey, it's Monday, we're having our growth meeting on Tuesday, nominate your top 3. It will take them hours to pick through all of those ideas. That's why I think keeping it really simple is important. But more importantly, instead of asking for 100 ideas, asking for your best 2 ideas or 3 ideas that will help us do X, right? That's a good way to, put the focus on some objective that you believe is going to impact the North Star metric. So I think the idea stage and the testing stage, you have to back up that step. If you jump right to, let's jump into testing and ideas, guilty. You will, there are a million things you can test, but even if they win, they might not really be impactful, right? So it's important to take that step back, look at how your growth engine drives your North Star metric, figure out where that high leverage opportunity lives, right? Maybe it's in acquisition, maybe it's in retention, maybe it's in monetization, but wherever that lives, getting everyone to focus their ideation around that. If they come up with other ideas, find a bucket for that for now, but try to, even, and as a growth leader, a growth meeting leader, I've even said, I'm going to go through and I'm going to pick the ideas, a bucket of ideas for us to consider. And some people might say, well, then you're throwing people's ideas because you don't agree with them. But I just realized at some point, going through 110 ideas for that particular one, or 112 ideas, whatever it was, just wasn't practical. I was going to get, instead of having good nominations the next day, we're going to have no nominations because people are going to say, I didn't have a chance to get through them all.
Yeah, man, again, great practitioner insights, and the suggestion to have somebody with expertise join us has just paid off.
Well, I've ruined a lot of experiments. So.
Yeah. Thank you for us getting to learn from your, scraped knees and stubbed toes. So thank you so much, Ethan, for joining us. How can people follow you?
Just reach out to me on LinkedIn, or you can find me on Twitter really easily. But yeah, I always love to chat with people and hear about their growth challenges. So I'm easy to find. Also, you can check breakoutgrowth.net, which is Sean and I's companion site to our podcast, and we publish a lot of content there. So I've written things like how to capture learnings from experiments. That I've published things like that there. So hopefully valuable content for people to peruse.
Yeah, fantastic. I know I've caught several of your interviews, and I've even shared some of them. They're really good. So appreciate all your insights today. And for those of you listening, we'll be back again next Friday to discuss chapters 5 and 6. And then don't forget that on Tuesday, May 31st, Sean Ellis is going to join us. We'll get to ask him anything within reason. And thank you, everyone. Hope you have a great weekend.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Justin.